illegal at the federal level. The reason he did this was because there were far more marijuana users in the United States at that time than there were opiate and cocaine users. Anslinger immediately looked to the themes of racism and violence to draw national attention to the problem he wanted to create. Now, this is the oldest political principle known to mankind. I've heard it called the Heligon principle. It basically goes like this. First, you create a problem. Then you create fear and opposition to the problem through media and propaganda. And then you offer a solution to the problem when the people demand it in the form of tighter government control. And this is exactly what happened with marijuana in the 30s with Anslinger. He also promoted and frequently read from what are referred to as gore files, wild, reefer madness-style exploitation tales of marijuana smoking axe murderers and sex offenders and Negroes. Here are some of the quotes attributed to Harry J. Anslinger and his gore files. Quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." Quote, "The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races." Quote, "Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death." Quote, "Reefer makes darkies think they are as good as the white men." And many others just like that. This man loved to pull out his own version of the assassin definition. He was quoted as saying, "In the year 1090, there was founded in Persia the religious and military order of the Assassins, whose history is one of cruelty, barbarity, and murder. And for good reason. The members were confirmed users of hashish or marijuana, and it's from the Arabs. Hashin that we have is the English word for assassin." Now, today, even those who are opposed to the legalization of marijuana for moral reasons or because they're still operating under the misinformation that was created 70 years ago, know better than to think that the use of marijuana makes a person violent. The drug just doesn't do that, if you even want to call it a drug. Let's call it a plant. Now, Harry Anslinger was not alone in his campaign. There were other rich and powerful men who had other reasons to want hemp and marijuana criminalized. And Anslinger sought help from those men. One of them was William Randolph Hearst, a name that's widely known through America even today. He owned a huge chain of newspapers. His family had wealth from vast mineral holdings. In fact, it was those mineral holdings that bought Hearst his first newspaper out in San Francisco. Hearst had a lot of reasons to help Anslinger. First, he hated Mexicans. Second, he had invested heavily in the timber industry to support his newspaper and didn't want to see the development of hemp paper in competition with that. He not only owned the forest land, he was heavily invested in the machinery required to make paper from wood pulp, which will not make paper from hemp. Third, and this is why he hated Mexicans, he had lost 800,000 acres of timberland to Pancho Villa in Mexico. So he hated them. And finally, telling lurid lies about Mexicans and the devil marijuana, sold newspapers, making him rich. Here's some samples from the San Francisco Examiner, that first newspaper in San Francisco I mentioned a moment ago. "Marijuana makes fiends of boys in 30 days. Hashish goads users to bloodlust." Here's another one. "By the tons it's coming into this country. The deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only the body but the very heart and soul of every human being who once becomes a slave to it in any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana cigarettes for a month and what was once your brain will be nothing but a storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea that any habit could get him." Now, if we read that today, we can see that that is just utter nonsense. Even the people who don't support the legalization of marijuana can't make these claims with a straight face today. Other newspapers followed suit because they wanted to sell papers just like Hearst. They didn't want to be one up. It was competition. If this was taking subscribers away from them and giving them to Hearst, well, they had to use the same method. They ran quotes like, users of marijuana become stimulated as they inhale the drug and are likely to do anything. Most crimes of violence in this section, especially in country districts, are laid to the users of that drug. These are just a few examples of the actual yellow journalism that was published during this time. But Hearst and Anslinger were not alone. They were supported by the DuPont Chemical Company and various pharmaceutical companies in an effort to outlaw hemp or cannabis or marijuana. DuPont had patented nylon, and they wanted hemp removed as competition because hemp made rope. Nylon made rope. The pharmaceutical companies could neither identify nor standardize cannabis dosage, and besides, with cannabis, folks could grow their own medicine and not have to purchase it from them. This all set the stage for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. After 2 years of planning in secret, Anslinger brought his plan to Congress, complete with a scrapbook piled full of Hearst's sensational editorials containing stories of axe murderers who had allegedly smoked marijuana and racial slurs. It was a remarkably short set of hearings. The one stick in Anslinger's spokes was the appearance by Dr. William C. Woodward, legislative counsel of the American Medical Association. Dr. Woodward started out by slamming Anslinger and the Bureau of Narcotics for distorting earlier AMA statements that had nothing to do with marijuana and making them appear that the AMA endorsed Anslinger's views. He also reproached the legislator and the Bureau for using the term marijuana in the legislation and not publicizing it as a bill about cannabis or hemp. At this point, marijuana was a sensationalist word used to refer to Mexicans smoking a drug and had not been connected in most people's minds to the existing cannabis/hemp plant. Therefore, many who had a legitimate reason to oppose the bill weren't even aware of it. Dr. Woodward further stated that the AMA was opposed to the legislation and further questioned the approach of the hearings, coming close to outright accusing Anslinger and the committee of misconduct. He was quoted as saying that there is a certain amount of narcotic addiction of an objectionable character no one will deny. The newspapers have called attention to it so prominently that there must be some grounds for their statements. You see, even Woodward was partially taken in by the Hearst propaganda. He went on to say, "It has surprised me, however, that the facts on which these statements have been based have not been brought before this committee by competent primary evidence. We are referred to newspaper publications concerning the prevalence of marijuana addiction. We are told that the use of marijuana causes crime, but yet no one is produced from the Bureau of Prisons to show the number of prisoners who have been found to be addicted to the marijuana habit. An informed inquiry shows that the Bureau of Prisons has no evidence on that point. You have been told that children are great users of marijuana cigarettes. No one has been summoned from the Children's Bureau to show the nature and extent of the habit among children. Inquiry of the Children's Bureau shows that they have no occasion to investigate it and know nothing particularly of it. Inquiry of the Office of Education, and they certainly should know something about the prevalence of habit among the school children of the country. If there is a prevalent habit, indicates that they have no occasion to investigate and know nothing of it." He went on to say, "Moreover, there is in the Treasury Department itself the Public Health Service with its Division of Mental Hygiene. The Division of Mental Hygiene was, in the first place, the Division of Narcotics. It was converted into the Division of Mental Hygiene, I think, about 1930. That particular bureau has control at the present time of the narcotic farms that were created in 1929 or 1930 and came into operation a few years later. No one has been summoned from that bureau to give evidence on that point." He continued by saying, "Informal inquiry by me indicates that they have no record of any marijuana or cannabis addicts who have ever been committed to those farms." He further stated, "The Bureau of Public Health Services has a division of pharmacology. If you desire evidence as to the pharmacology of cannabis, that obviously is a place where you can get direct and primary evidence rather than the indirect hearsay evidence. And he was referring to the newspaper articles by Hearst and other yellow journalists of the time. Now, committee members turned on Dr. Woodward. They questioned his motives in opposing legislation. Even the chairman joined in and was quoted as saying, "If you want to advise us on this legislation, you ought to come here with constructive proposals rather than criticism, rather than trying to throw obstacles in the way of something that the federal government is trying to do. It has not only an unselfish motive in this, but they have a serious responsibility." To that, Dr. Woodward commented, "We cannot understand yet, Mr. Chairman, why this bill should have been prepared in secret for 2 years without any intimation even to the profession that it was being prepared." After some further bantering, the chairman stated, "I would like to read a quotation from a recent editorial in the Washington Times." Now, here we go again. Our legislators are not relying on scientific fact. They're not relying on medical data. They're not relying on any studies whatsoever. All they're relying on is newspaper articles printed by Hearst and other yellow journalists who had a vested interest in seeing hemp outlawed to protect their own business interests. The chairman then went on to read that editorial from the Washington Times, which stated, "The marijuana cigarette is one of the most insidious of all forms of dope, largely because of the failure of the public to understand its fatal qualities." Fatal qualities? There has never been a documented case of a death caused by marijuana, by cannabis, by hemp. But yet, here's the chairman of the committee who's reading from the Washington Times and is using this information to support evidence that marijuana is deadly. Fatal qualities. The editorial went on to state, "The nation is almost defenseless against it, having no federal laws to cope with it and virtually no organized campaign for combating it. The result is tragic. School children are prey for the peddlers who infest school neighborhoods." I mean, come on, folks. If you read this in a newspaper today, even those of you listening to this broadcast who are opposed to the legalization of marijuana, if you read this in a newspaper today, would you pick up a copy of that paper the next day? Would you continue to pay for your subscription to a publication that would publish such obvious lies? No, of course you wouldn't. No, of course you wouldn't, or you wouldn't be still listening to this broadcast at this point. The chairman continued to quote that editorial from the Washington Times, saying, "The fatal marijuana cigarette must be recognized as a deadly drug, and American children must be protected against it." Now, again, we all know in the 21st century that whatever negative effects marijuana may have, and those haven't been scientifically determined, but if they have any, they're certainly not deadly. Now, when the chairman finished quoting that piece of yellow journalism, he stated, "That is a pretty severe indictment. They say it is a national question and that it requires effective legislation. Of course, in a general way, you have responded to all of these statements, but that indicates very clearly that it is an evil of such magnitude that it is recognized by the press of the country as such." So here you have the chairman of the federal committee that's deciding the fate of the plant marijuana, and you've got the legal counsel for the American Medical Association and a doctor standing before him and giving him facts and telling him that these methods that they're using to come to their conclusions are not scientific, telling him what the